Good evening and welcome to tomorrow's Tropics for 2020. It's another hurricane season outlook for this year. And please note, I'm not a meteorologist, and this outlook is not official in any way. It's totally unofficial and my opinion only. And without further ado, let's look into the factors going into the season. So first of all, let's look at the sea surface temperatures. So these are pretty good to look at even in July. And first off, let's look at the Atlantic. It looks kind of muddled now. It's not really that positive AMO that we're seeing during a lot of June, but there is. You can see that the main development region here, the MDR, is generally warmer than normal, except for this little patch of cooler than normal water in the central Atlantic, and it is actually warmed up quite a bit since the beginning of June, and as a result, I've raised my numbers, which I'll get to later. But it has cooled a bit from its peak earlier in June because of at least partially a major Saharan air layer outbreak that came off of Africa and is now pretty much gone. There's still some, but it's generally reduced. And also, you can see that there's a very warm area of water in the subtropics here that wasn't there back in June, or early June at least. And this isn't like very unfavorable, but if you do see this starting to get the 26-degree Celsius water in this region, then you might see a lot more instability in the subtropics instead of the tropics, and that kind of might mess up the Hadley cell a bit. So that would mean you have less instability in the tropics, and that would suppress activity there. An extreme case is 2013, where the tropic or subtropics rapidly warmed, and you had a very inactive season. That doesn't look likely. This could fizzle or not be a very big entity. We shall see. Next up, let's look at the Insull Phase. And it looks like the predictions for La Nina are backing off a little bit because the Indian Ocean here isn't quite favorable for that, or as favorable as it was. But it is generally in cool neutral, especially towards the east right here. And that looks to continue because there's still cold water under the surface, and the atmosphere still supports negative ENSO. And you can see why that is favorable on here because, if you basically look at this, it's the velocity potential, so at the upper levels. So basically, negatives mean that there is divergence there, and positives mean that there is convergence, so that means upper divergence is rising air. However, I have reversed this because I'm trying to show La Nina here, so this means you have sinking air in this region, and rising air in this region typically during a La Nina. This isn't quite what we're going to be looking at, I think, this season, but it does give you good, or at least a decent look at what's going on. And if you kind of imagine this as in the sort of Walker cell here, see there's sinking air here, and there's like generally rising air here. And if you connect the dots, so at the upper levels, it'll try to travel to the west towards that sinking air. And once it sinks, you can see it's going to travel to the east, where there's more rising air. And as you could see there, that reduces westerly winds aloft, so it lowers shear, and it also reduces trade winds. So that means you have warmer tropical waters, and at the same time, you'll also have more vorticity or cyclonic flow at the surface that tropical waves can take advantage of. So you have more rising air in areas where it's favorable, so like the Indian Ocean and Africa, and sinking air where it's unfavorable, and less outflow from tropical cyclones or convection in general that you tend to see during El Nino. And you can see that why it's generally looks favorable for negative ENSO, even though it might not be all that strong. And there's a couple other features. You can see there's a generally horseshoe type look to the PDO, but you can see it's not the usual. Usually it's more kind of like this, uh, from Alaska going down into the equatorial regions, and it tends to force an El Nino. But you can see it's totally confined to this area. You do have that warm or cool water off of Japan too. But you can see it's totally confined to the subtropics. The 20 degrees north latitude is about here-ish, and you can see that this warm water is almost totally confined to that area, and the water to the south in the pretty much entire Pacific is cooler than that. So it looks like the entire Pacific tropics, including the Eastern Pacific, will struggle with some stable air, which also helps the Atlantic because there'll be less outflow from tropical cyclones in the Eastern Pacific, which looks less active, and more rising air because there's more sinking air here. And finally, let's look at the Indian Ocean. And contrary to predictions of a positive Indian Ocean dipole, where you have warm waters bunch up against Indonesia here, and you have cooler waters upwelling off of Africa, we're seeing a neutral to even negative or even positive Indian Ocean dipole, and that's because of a very dominant rising cell over Africa. So that is kind of putting us or slowing down the progression to La Nina. So it looks like we might not get a strong event instead of a weaker event. That is actually unfortunately more favorable for the Atlantic usually. But it looks like we won't see this become negative over here. We'll continue to see it maybe look like this, maybe get more a bit more positive, but it's not going to be very negative, it looks like, and that is as a result of Africa. Now let's take a look at the velocity potential at the upper levels for the past 2 months. So this is starting at the beginning of May and ending pretty much as late as the data goes, which is June 28th in this case. And here, again, this is sinking air because it is positive. That means you have convergence aloft and divergence aloft here where you have rising air. And here you can see where I mentioned that rising cell over Africa is extremely dominant here. It's just like ruling the western half of the Indian Ocean and Africa, and it's just a very dominant feature that is pretty much choking out this rising air in the Indonesian region that you tend to see with La Nina, and that's why you're seeing less of that La Nina getting going, because you're seeing a lot more of that forcing kind of shifted to the west in the Indian Ocean, and this is a favorable look for the Atlantic because if you look at the Walker cell type thing I was outlining earlier, see there's a lot of rising air here. There's sinking air in the Eastern Pacific, possibly due to that stability as a result of the sea surface temperature look. And again, connecting the dots, you have easterly winds at the upper levels and westerly winds at the lower levels. So these are anomalies. But what you see here is reduced shear because the winds look out of the east in the upper levels and more out of the west in the lower levels. So you have warmer waters, and you have additionally lowered shear, but again, more vorticity and slower moving waves, so they can spin up more easily. Now, why is there so much rising air over here? Well, that is related to the West African monsoon. Now, looking at this plot, courtesy of Eric Webb, these are precipitation anomalies over the past 2 months that are averaged throughout this period. Per day, the anomalies are just like off the charts. Like Africa's been pretty active pretty much every year since 2016 now, and you've had a similar type of standing wave like we are seeing. But even then, this is just totally off the charts. Like, I mean, look at this. The entire Sahel region is pretty much like at least several millimeters per day above average as a 2-month average. So it's just totally insane. We're probably going to see a lot more tropical waves and stronger ones. So there's probably going to be more seeds that can actually get going, and become tropical cyclones in the tropical Atlantic when conditions become favorable, because they're still generally not favorable enough for them to develop, though we have seen some impressive African easterly waves that have tried to develop but have failed because it's too dry or it's too much shear. Again, it's only really July. It's very early for uh, tropical cyclones in the main development region. Now, looking here, you can see that the zonal wind at 700 millibars is very cyclonic. So here you have anomalies up to 9 meters per second, averaged over about 2 months again. So having major westerly anomalies here, and major easterly, or not really major, but you have some easterly anomalies here. And what that means is you have waves coming off maybe around this latitude. So that not only means that they're moving slightly slower than usual, which again lets them spin up more easily, but it's the anomalous cyclonic or anticyclonic flow here is very tilted towards anomalous cyclonic flow. And if you have a lot of anomalous cyclonic flow in the tropical Atlantic, you tend to see a lot more of that in very active seasons. So the West African monsoon does look like it's going to be a factor that supports a more active season, uh, as with a few other factors. Now let's take a look at a couple other factors that are occurring right now. You can see here is the sea level pressure anomaly in millibars here, and there's in the past 2 months there's been a kind of interesting little pattern here. It's almost like a 2x2 not tic-tac-toe, but 2x2 checkers board here. So you have lower pressures in these two regions and higher pressures in these two regions. I'm honestly not really sure why, but you can see why this area has warmed up, or sea surface temperatures have warmed up anomalously, because there's ridging over here, which is promoting weaker winds and more sunlight, which is able to warm the water. This also suggests that if it stays around, you might have more tropical cyclones that can't really escape because there's no troughs that can get through this ridge, and instead they are kind of forced to move east. So that is not really a very good looking pattern if it doesn't change, though it could change if we are lucky. It's really hard to tell steering this far out, and even then, if you do have a well-defined steering regime, sometimes you have storms that don't follow it, and so it's really impossible to say where we'll get impacted by any given storm. If you look at the tropics here, you can see there's some low pressure that has dropped into this region, and there isn't too much of it. So if this continues, it's not the healthiest looking Hadley cell where you have like a ridge bridge here and lower pressures around here, but it's not very unhealthy. It's kind of mixed. But you can see why there has been that warming, and that's because there's some higher pressure to the south. So that's what that positive AMM pattern here, and that lower pressure to the north means you have generally westerly winds following around here. And indeed, if you look at the trade wind anomalies over the same time period, you can see there's a core of westerly anomalies that is becoming more that has moved a bit more to the north. So it's pretty much in the entire tropical Atlantic. So it is indeed moving north, and that's probably one reason why you are seeing that warming of the tropics, because there is weaker winds, and that has allowed the tropical Atlantic to cool from near average to solidly above average. Now, again, it's cooled because of Saharan air layer, but it is likely that we're going to continue to see something like this, and probably a rebound to those very above average sea surface temperatures, unless there's something unforeseen that happens. And here you can see that ridge, and unfortunately, those enhanced easterly winds are also the north, so they don't really help to cool down the tropical Atlantic. Given that conditions just look broadly favorable right now, I'm kind of forced to move my numbers even more up. Right now, I'm generally expecting 19 to 22 named storms, and that's including the 4 we've already had up to Dolly just earlier. So that is even just the early season activity is pumping up the numbers. And then 10 to 11 hurricanes, 4 to 5 major hurricanes, and an accumulated cyclone energy index of 160 to 200. So it is a pretty high-end forecast, but it's hard to be too much lower because the conditions are just. It's hard to find an expressly unfavorable condition. Now, it's very hard to actually forecast where you'll see activity, but it looks like generally the tropical Atlantic does look like it'll be a hotter spot than usual. Hotter spot than usual in a given season, just because the conditions look to line up to be favorable in this region. There could be some subtropical activity as we have seen, especially if this sticks around, but I think it'll be a bit less because the tropics seem to be more of driver of activity now that there's not very warm anomalies against cooler anomalies here, or you have stable air like last year that was generally in this region. But obviously there's a good possibility of some subtropical activity. The Caribbean looks a bit more favorable this year because there's expected to be less shear in this region, which has hit it a lot. But it really comes down to tracks because a year like, say, 2017, it was mostly favorable for the Caribbean. But either had storms coming in too early, such as Brett or Dawn, or you had Harvey come in here and still get sheared, except from the east. So it was more bad timing than anything, really. Or you had a lot of storms such as Irma or Maria that just tracked to the north and kind of missed. So it's hard to tell. It's more up to tracks, and if we do get a stronger ridge, you might see more Caribbean activity if it is or if the tracks do favor that, but it's hard to tell at this point. But the Caribbean does look more favorable, but we shall see what happens in that region. And again, even if it's as active as I'm expecting, or even more so, or if this is a total bust like say 2013, it only takes one storm hitting your area, especially if it's strong, to make it a bad season for your area. So no matter what the forecast is, whether it's supposed to be an inactive season or a completely hyperactive season, always be prepared for a hit from a tropical cyclone and hope for the best and prepare for the worst. If you have any questions or comments about my forecast, please let me know. And thanks for watching.